What's up, guys? This is bluetea-TCG back with another Vanguard deck profile, this time for V Premium. This is going to be a V Premium Blaster deck profile, so yes, Shadow Paladin. And Shadow Paladin has had an interesting tenure throughout V Premium. They've fallen between the realm of Tier 0 and Tier 1 a couple of times, of course. Right when Luard released in VBTO 10, Luard was definitely up there in terms of being one of the most powerful decks that existed in V Series. And since then, we've got basically only Mordred Phantom, basically Revenger, as well as I think some people are still running Luard, but the builds are kind of interesting now because you do have to make a decision between Nemain, Karin, and Grade 3 Luard himself. So with that in mind, we're gonna go right into this deck profile for Blasters. We'll start off with the Grade 0s and Trigger lineup. We've got one copy of our starter Fullbau. Of course, the V Series starter is required to be run in V Premium, so there's nothing really much to say about this card, other than, interestingly, this is the pre-errata print of Fullbau, so it's going to have that when wrote upon draw card and not mention explicitly the get the quick shield if your opponent's at grade 1 or greater, but this does function the same as all the other V Series starters. All right, and then for the triggers, we're going to start off with our heal trigger. We've got 4 copies of Abyss Healer. So Abyss Healer is, I think you could decide to run Abyssal Chain Dragon instead, which is the Heal Guardian for Shadow Paladin. Although I do like Abyss Healer in this deck because I've not really seen Heal Guardians come up too much, or I've not seen there to be a need for Heal Guardians as much as there was back when Hamiel and Luard, as a full power Luard, not the Luard that exists right now. When those were running rampant, I definitely think Heal Guardians were kind of a necessary thing to combat those. But I think for Shadow Paladins nowadays, especially with the fact that we have the ride skip available, we're the ones putting the pressure on the opponent, so I'm not sure if Heal Guardians are too necessary. Plus, that extra 5k shield is actually pretty important late game, so we're going to make use of that while also making sure we can continue to defend up to those high magic numbers that allow us to leverage the fact that we have a 13k base Vanguard most of the game. So I do think it is worth running the 20k shield heal triggers, but if you feel more comfortable with Heal Guardians, those can work too. It's not a huge deal. All right, and then for the rest of the triggers, we've got 8 crits. So we're running Darkside Trumpeter for one of our crits, and we're running Death Feather Eagle as our other crit. So 8 crits, again, pretty standard for V Premium, especially for Shadows. You want that crit pressure on your rearguard attacks, especially when you go into your Phantom Blaster Overlord. That way, once your Phantom Blaster Overlord does its drive checks, you can apply the crits and powers to the rearguards. That way your opponent does have to decide to pull out a lot of the cards from hand. And this will especially be important when I get to Dead Armor Dragon, which is one of the grade 1s that allows us to guard restrict our attacks by retiring it as cost. So these crits do really well in this deck. You don't really want to run front triggers, of course, because we're not an Excel deck that can really benefit from it, but 8 crits is perfectly fine and is pretty much standard for V Premium. And finally, we've got 4 copies of our Draw PG Dark Shield McLear. Again, pretty standard. Nothing really much to say about it other than the fact that it's a PG on a draw trigger means that you will be able to cycle through your deck a lot more, and the fact that it doesn't take up your grade 1 space makes a huge difference, since we do need that grade 1 space for cards like Nemain and the other cards that support the Nemain Engine, as well as all the blaster cards that we're running to maximize our use of Phantom Blaster Overlord. So that's our trigger lineup in grade 0s. Pretty standard stuff, not really much to say about it. Let's go right into the grade 1s. We'll start off with the Nemain. We'll start off with the most important card of the deck herself. We've got 4 copies of Nemain, and then some of the supporting cards for the Nemain Engine. We've got 2 copies of Abyssal Owl and 2 copies of Freezing Witch Bendi. So let me get all of these into the camera a little centered. So the combination of these 8 cards is what basically comprises our Nemain Engine. This is how we get the ride skip from grade 1, or not grade 1 to grade 3, but rather this is how we get the ride skip to grade 3. As long as we open one of these Nemains on our opening hand, they were guaranteed Phantom Blaster Overlord by our second turn, which is what made Luard Tier 0 back when that first released in VBTO 10. And it's what also makes this deck a lot stronger. That ride skip alone is probably what makes this deck, pretty playable in the current meta, especially considering that we go through a lot of our deck at that point, so we're allowed to get those triggers more easily when we start going into our drive checks. And one thing that Nemain also does going into late game is she allows you to get your Dead Armor Dragon directly from deck, which we'll go over Dead Armor Dragon's role in this deck pretty soon. But Dead Armor Dragon is what we'll need mid to late game as we start to implement the control elements of this deck, where we start retiring our opponent's rear guards and we start controlling how our opponent guards our attacks, making them use a lot of cards from hand, and that way they're left with little to no resources by the time they get to their turn. So that's what Nemain does for this deck. And then Abyssal Owl, of course, functions in concert with Nemain. Abyssal Owl allows us to get some card draw from our deck right after calling it off of Nemain. And then also, of course, Abyssal Owl means Abyssal Owl also allows you to, wow, Abyssal Owl is quite a mouthful every time I say it. Also allows you to use Abyssal Owl as retire fodder for cards like Phantom Blaster Overlord and Phantom Blaster Dragon. So just do keep in mind that after you use Abyssal Owl's School, you do have it available for retire fodder if necessary. And then we got 2 copies of Bendi, of course, to facilitate the ride skip itself. Bendi's sole purpose in this deck is for the ride skip, and the reason we're running 2 copies of her is so that we can get the ride chain off more consistently, just in case we don't open with Nemain, and then also just in case Bendi appears in our damage zone on our first grade 1 turn, then we can still have another Bendi in deck to go into off of the Nemain. That way we won't miss the ride skip still. So just to illustrate an example, I will illustrate the example in the combos after I complete this deck list. But basically, if you don't have Bendi in your hand, you go into Nemain on rearguard circle, use Nemain to call Dumphood Dragon, and then Dumphood Dragon adds you back the Blaster Dark. Then you ride Blaster Dark the next turn. Then you use Nemain again to call Bendi, and then of course you go into your Phantom Blaster Dragon to ride skip. All right, so that's going to do it for the Nemain Engine. And of course, Bendi later on in the game is pretty much a dead 5k card, so you can use her as retire fodder off of Nemain if necessary. But of course, you can also just use her as 10k shield if she's in your hand. All right, so for the other grade 1s, we've got 3 copies of Dead Armor Dragon and 2 copies of Branwen, which is our grade 3 searcher. Let me move these over a little bit, and then 1 copy of Blaster Dagger. So we'll explain each of these individually because these cards don't really complement each other per se, but they're all supporting cast members of our Nemain Engine, which is the core of this Blaster deck. So we'll go ahead and explain these because all 3 of these cards are kind of individually functioning. We've got 3 copies of Dead Armor Dragon. This is how we facilitate our control element of the Blaster deck. Basically, you can select which attack to use this on because it allows you to Soul Blast 1 and retire itself. And then for that battle, when your opponent will call cards from hand, they would have to call 2 or more. So basically a guard restrict that you can select when you want to use it basically allows you to gauge how much shield value your opponent has in their hand and determine when and where you want to make them burn cards from their hand. That way you're still in control of not only their field but also their hand size. And this is really important to manage, especially when you go into your Phantom Blaster Overlord attacks, because Phantom Blaster Overlord will typically be at 23,000 power 2 crit for the majority of the game. And if you boost Dead Armor Dragon behind Phantom Blaster Overlord, then you can save the Dead Armor Dragon for your other rearguard attack when you call a Blaster card from your deck off of Phantom Blaster Overlord skill. So basically, there's a lot of flexibility to Dead Armor Dragon, and it's terrific that we got this reprinted in one of the clan selection sets, I believe it was, because for a while this card was a promo only, and that was unfortunate. It was really hard to obtain it, but I'm glad that we got it as a reprint and definitely going to make full use of it in this Blaster deck. And next up, we've got 2 copies of Branwen. This is our grade 3 searcher. Usually with this grade 3 searcher, you're looking for Phantom Blaster Overlords that you will rewrite into to generate more force markers, but this card is not really needed for most of the game. Typically you're relying on the ride skip in this deck. You don't really need desperately the grade 3s to get to the rewrites, but it is really nice to have the rewrites available. So having the 2 copies of the grade 3 searcher does allow you to see those Phantom Blaster Overlords more consistently, and thus get those Force 1 markers stacked on your rearguard circles. And of course, it's nice that it's also a 13k booster, but that doesn't really come up too often because usually your boosters are cards like Dead Armor Dragon or even Blaster Dagger, which let's go into next. So we've got 2 copies of Blaster Dagger. This card is not really being used, I think, to its full potential. I think this card is actually really good, not just in, of course, this deck being a Blaster deck, but also in a couple other decks that might need the extra soul and the extra control element to retire opponent's rearguard. Now, of course, this card is an on-hit, so basically its skill can only trigger when the attack it boosts or attacked with, when that attack hits, which is a little bit of a shortcoming of it. But that also plays really well with the theme of this deck, which is the control element. We're determining whether our opponent we're in control of whether our opponent guards or not. And when they see this card and they're like, oh yeah, on hit it goes into soul and I have to retire a rearguard, the opponent most likely doesn't want you to do that, so they'll start guarding with cards from hand. And you can also use Dead Armor Dragon's skill to tempt them into taking the attack. That way you can get this card skill off, because typically when you use Dead Armor Dragon's skill, they're like, oh, I don't want to guard then because I have to use 2 cards from hand. So in that regard, this will allow the Blaster Dagger to go off. You get it back into the soul, just in case you're running out of cards in your soul. And you really, because that does actually happen with this deck. With all the soul blasting we're doing early game to go into the ride skip, late game you start running out of soul if you're not able to rewrite a bunch. So you do need the soul. You do need the soul eventually, and Blaster Dagger allows us to accomplish that. Now, of course, it's funny because Dead Armor Dragon's skill requires soul itself, so do be careful in that regard. But the good thing is, at least if you're able to use Dead Armor Dragon's skill to bait the opponent into not guarding, then you'll get that soul right back with Blaster Dagger's skill. And of course, Blaster Dagger is doubly good because it has Blaster in its name, which makes it another target of ours when we go into Phantom Blaster Overlord. So do keep that in mind. That's actually the reason why we're running it. So pairs perfectly with Dead Armor Dragon, and of course has Blaster in its name. So terrific card, and thankfully it does not require counterblast, so makes it even better for this deck. That's going to do it for the grade 1s. Let's go into the grade 2s now. We've got 4 copies of Blaster Dark. This is no surprise. Blaster Dark is the main grade 2 ride. This is the card that we're looking for in order to get the ride skip off. Now, the interesting thing about Blaster Dark is that typically when you go into your Phantom Blaster Overlord turns, you're looking for either a Blaster Axe, Blaster Rapier, or Blaster Dagger. But Blaster Dark also has Blaster in its name and is a 10k card that has intercept, so it's not a bad option to call it a front or rearguard circle, especially if you have a lot of force markers on there. Plus, it does have an on place. It doesn't matter from where it's placed. Its on place allows you to retire your opponent's rearguard if you want. But typically, since you'll be retiring off of the Phantom Blaster Overlord skill anyway, we're not really looking to use this skill too often. But if you somehow miss the ride skip, then the active Vanguard skill is pretty good, allows you to get extra drive, which means you'll be able to cycle through your deck a little more. So don't forget to use Blaster Dark skills when they do come up, especially since sometimes you do miss the ride skip. You don't want to rely on the ride skip all the time, because although it is incredibly consistent, sometimes it just happens that you're not able to pull it off. So do keep that in mind. But again, we're running the 4 Blaster Darks just in case we're not able to get the Nemain in our hand. But if we still have the Bendi in our hand plus the Blaster Dark, then we're able to still get the ride skip off. And then next up, we've got 2 copies of Dumphood. This is our searcher for Blaster Dark. This is typically what you'll go into off of your turn 1 from Nemain. And if you don't have a Blaster Dark in your hand already, even if you do, to be honest, I think it's still good to use the Nemain to get Dumphood and then add the Blaster Dark, because you're just getting some extra deck thinning off of that. Plus, cycling into Dumphood Dragon means that you're dumping, interestingly, you're dumping one of the cards that's not as good going into late game. The reason why Dumphood Dragon is not as good late game, it is basically only searchable through Nemain. And typically with this deck, we're cycling with the Blaster, the cards with Blaster in their name because of Phantom Blaster Overlord. And unfortunately, Dumphood does not have Blaster in its name. So late game, it does kind of fall off. Plus, it is only a 10k card when you have a Vanguard Blaster in its name. Now, I say only 10k. Technically, that's not bad because Blaster Dark is also 10k. But at least Blaster Dark has something on place. This card doesn't do anything when it's placed, so we probably wouldn't want to call it with Phantom Blaster Overlord anyway. But do keep in mind that this card is mainly for your early game ride chain, your ride skip, as well as if you at any point need to search a Blaster Dark, then you can just go into Nemain into this, and then you can get your Blaster Dark right there. So 2 copies of Dumphood. And again, we're running 2 copies of this because if we see one in the damage zone, then we still have another one in our deck, just in case it comes to that, and we're still able to go to the right skip, into Blaster Dark, etc. And then next up, we're going to round off our grade 2 lineup with the blaster package of our grade 2s. We got 3 copies of Blaster Rapier and 2 copies of Blaster Axe. So again, these cards probably not expected. I don't see these cards being often run in a lot of Shadow Paladin decks in V Premium, but I do think these cards are amazing in Blaster, specifically in V Premium, just because we have some extra targets to call off of our Phantom Blaster Overlord, which allows us to get a bunch of multi-attacks, and having Blaster Rapier available is actually amazing. Once again, it's another one of those on-hits, which, you know, I know on-hits might be a little repulsive to most people, but this on-hit functions really well because, again, we have Dead Armor Dragon to allow ourselves to control how our opponent guards, and if they decide not to guard, then of course we get to control their field. And then plus the fact that Blaster Rapier gets an extra 5k when you have 3 blasters on your field, really easy to fulfill, which allows Blaster Rapier to hit magic numbers immediately without needing any force markers or anything like that. So this card can get up to 14k as a beat stick against every other deck, including in the Force Mirror, which happens to be really useful and makes a huge difference. I think Blaster Rapier is honestly underrated for blasters, especially because of that. And then, of course, the on-hit retire an opponent's rear guard is really useful with Dead Armor Dragon, as aforementioned. So do make sure to make use of Blaster Rapier. This is the card I typically go into off of PBO, and I do think our next best option in Blaster Axe also has its uses, because at 2 copies, we're able to decide whether to call this with Phantom Blaster Overlord or to keep it in hand if we already have it in hand, because it is a 10k shield. Even though it is a vanilla beater, it's a 10k shield, which is really useful, especially on a rearguard circle off of PBO, where we're able to intercept with it and still make use of the cards in our hand, just in case we need that extra shield. So these 2 cards combined make for a great pair when combined with PBO and the rest of our blaster package. And then now onto our grade 3s. The grade 3s are pretty simple. We've got 3 copies of Phantom Blaster Dragon and 4 copies of PBO, Phantom Blaster Overlord. So this is our grade 3 lineup. Again, very simple. We got Phantom Blaster Dragon for the right skip. Phantom Blaster Dragon is pretty much only for the right skip. I never use its skill personally, especially not its second skill. Honestly, the second skill feels like a little bit of a gimmick in some respects, because you're giving your opponent extra damage, which can be good, but oftentimes it ends up just giving them a trigger, and that makes your attacks kind of miss their magic numbers. You know, oftentimes in that stage of the game, when you've ridden your second Phantom Blaster Overlord, you don't really have enough force markers to put enough pressure on your opponent if they get a trigger. So I do think that second skill can be more of a drawback than a benefit. But at the same time, I guess it is available if you want to put some pressure on them and you're feeling confident that they won't get a trigger. But the first skill of Phantom Blaster Dragon, is the more useful of the 2. It allows you to retire 3 of your rear guards, and then your opponent retires 3 of their rear guards, and then Phantom Blaster Dragon gets plus 15k and a crit. So if you happen to go into like a couple of Nemains and a couple of Abyssal Owls, and they're not really doing too much on your field, then of course you can sack them with Phantom Blaster Dragon skill to get that power off. But again, you're not really going to be using Phantom Blaster Dragon skill most of the time. Most of the time it's just there for the ride skip, which is why it's at 3 copies. But the main card we're looking to ride into after our ride chain is Phantom Blaster Overlord. This card is actually amazing. At first I thought this card was a little underwhelming, especially since I was still running Ghost Blaster Dragon, which I thought was a solid card overall. But then later I realized that all the blaster support that actually complements this card makes it a fantastic card, especially with the aforementioned cards that we're running in our grade 2 and grade 1 lineup in terms of Blaster Dagger, Blaster Rapier, Blaster Axe. All of those cards really work super well with Phantom Blaster Overlord and allow us to make full use of the card and all that it has to offer. Let's go ahead and understand both of its skills. The first skill is a continuous ability. Basically, it functions like a cross ride, if you guys are familiar with that from the original era of Vanguard. Basically, if you have Phantom Blaster Dragon in your soul, this unit's going to get plus 10,000 power, and original critical becomes 2 during your turn, which is extremely important. Again, you're not really usually putting force markers on your Vanguard with this deck, so the fact that it can hit the 23,000 power number on its own, as long as you fulfill the cross-ride condition, plus have the original critical become 2, basically means that you never need to put force markers on your Vanguard for the whole game. And it also allows you to have more flexibility in terms of your Dead Armor Dragon. You can also decide to use Dead Armor Dragon on your Vanguard's attack, and it will work out because, again, 23,000 power, typically your opponent would just guard with one card from hand, like a 20k shield, to make it at like 33. Sometimes they'll also just perfect guard, but if they decide to perfect card the 23,000 2-crit attack, they'll need another card from their hand with Dead Armor Dragon, which means that they'll be guarding with they'll be burning 3 cards from their hand off of a simple attack that that doesn't even rival the power that your rear guards will have, especially after you use Phantom Blaster Overlord's second skill, which let's go over it really quickly. So when it attacks a Vanguard, you counterblast 1 and retire any number of your rear guards. Then your opponent chooses the same number of their rear guards that you retired and retire them. And then you search your deck for 1 card with Blaster in its name, call it to a rear guard circle, shuffle your deck, and that unit gets plus 10,000 power. So that skill is what allows you to go into your multi-attacks, which is what makes it complement really well with cards like Blaster Rapier, which has an on-hit that makes your opponent really question how they should guard. It allows you to be in control of how they guard. And then, of course, when you pair that with Dead Armor Dragon, once again, you'll be able to really put the pressure on them, and it allows you to have the utmost flexibility, of course, when you've used your Nemain properly and you've managed your counterblast properly. The good thing about this deck is that it actually doesn't go through counterblast that fast as long as you're wise with them. Especially, again, we're not really using counterblast on Phantom Blaster Dragon. We're mostly using those counterblasts for this card's second skill, as well as sometimes Blaster Rapier and Blaster Dark. Blaster Dark I typically don't use because I do want to have that the threat of Blaster Rapiers on hit present, so at least the opponent's thinking about it every time. But yeah, overall, this deck actually does really well, especially with Phantom Blaster Overlord's second skill. It allows you to get those multi-attacks, and that extra 10,000 power really makes a difference, especially when you get those rearguard numbers up to like 30k, 40k, and with those on hits as well, the opponent's probably going to be guarding most of the time, unless they want to say goodbye to their rear guards that they have. So yeah, overall, pretty solid deck. Let's go ahead and go over some of the basic combos so that you guys have an idea before I close off this video. The first basic combo involves, of course, our ride chain. So let me go ahead and grab the necessary cards. And all you really need for this ride chain is 1 Nemain. So let me go ahead and get the Nemain. And then you need literally any other grade 1. For example, we can have like Branwen. It literally does not matter. As long as you have 1 Nemain in your starting hand and 1 other grade 1, then you'll be able to get the full ride chain with this deck. Because all the soul that you need for this ride chain is given to you from the natural rides. So let's go ahead and start with that. We're going to ride the Branwen. We're not going to bother with the skill, although its skill is mandatory to check the top 5. For now, just to speed things up, we're not going to bother. And we're also not going to bother with the when wrote upon draw card, just for time's purposes. So then we call the Nemain from hand, and then we use Nemain's ability to rest. And then we search for the Dumphood Dragon. So Dumphood Dragon is going to be, let me see, looks like, I forgot what Dumphood Dragon looks like. So we get the Dumphood Dragon, and then we're able to use Dumphood Dragon skill right away when we go into the main phase. We're still in the main phase, of course, because we use Nemain. So we retire the Dumphood Dragon, and we Soul Blast 1. And then we add to hand our Blaster Dark. So this Blaster Dark is going to be in our hand for the rest of this turn. And then on our next turn, let's say we take a damage. It doesn't really matter what goes in the damage zone, but to convince you that running 2 copies of each of the card in the ride line is good, we're just going to say that Bendi goes to the damage zone, right? I'm not sure if you see that there. There we go. We're going to say Bendi goes to the damage zone. So now we draw for turn. It doesn't really matter what we draw. We're not going to even bother with that. Then we ride Blaster Dark. You can decide to use its skill, of course, but typically the opponent won't be calling any rear guards on their grade 1 turn, so they probably won't have anything to retire. And then we go into the main phase. Oh, this should be standing up because we should be standing up everything during our stand phase. Then we're going to use Nemain's skill again, and this time we're going to grab the Bendi from our deck that is still there. We're going to call her to rearguard circle. It doesn't really matter which rearguard circle you call her to. Then we're going to use her skill right away. We're going to Soul Blast the card that we rode last turn. We're going to retire her. Because we have Blaster Dark as our Vanguard, we're actually going to be able to search our deck for Phantom Blaster Dragon. And we ride it. So the nice thing about going into Phantom Blaster Dragon here is that you already get your force marker. So that means you'll have the extra force marker for when you go into your Phantom Blaster Overlord turns. And of course, you want to put the force marker typically on your rearguard circle, because the rear guards are the ones that are going to benefit the most from Phantom Blaster Overlord. Phantom Blaster Overlord is kind of self-sufficient in terms of having enough power already, because he's going to be at 23-2 crit for most of the game. And if you boost him, he'll be a little more as well, just to hit those magic numbers if necessary. So just keep that in mind, that we do really want most of the time to have the force markers on the rearguard circle. But, you know, in terms of our first grade 3 ride, our first grade 3 turn, since we don't have Phantom Blaster Overlord just yet, it's not a bad thing to put the force marker on the Vanguard if you want to put more pressure on them. But at the same time, again, it's not really needed. You can just put the force markers in the rearguard circles just to prepare for the Phantom Blaster Overlord turns in the future. But yeah, that's kind of the first combo. And then the subsequent combos, so let's go ahead and clean this up quickly here. And then the other combo basically involves, it's not really like a combo per se, but it involves having the Dead Armor Dragons on the field. So if you saw earlier when I explained how Bendi works, you probably already understand what I'm going into. But basically, let's say you have the Nemain, let's say you have the Dead Armor Dragon that you called from Nemain. And then, just trying to look through here what we've got. So let's say your Vanguard is Phantom Blaster Overlord with, of course, a Phantom Blaster Dragon in the soul. And then finally, of course, you got some force markers. So we're going to bring back our force marker here. Typically, it's not unusual to have 2 force markers on one of the circles and 1 force marker on the other one. So we'll have it exactly like that. And then we're going to have a Blaster Rapier and then a Blaster Dark. All right, so first we attack with the Vanguard. This is going to be the 23,000 and 2 crit as mentioned earlier. And of course we do our drive check. Oh no, we wouldn't do our drive check first. Actually, let me start over. So basically this is our field setup, right? And let's say we have some damage too. Let's just put a couple cards here into the damage zone. So let's say we have 3 cards face up in our damage zone there. Maybe not those 3 cards, because we do want some blasters to call from the deck. So let's go ahead and put these 3 cards in the damage zone. All right. Then we go ahead and proceed by attacking with the rear guard first. So the goal here is to get some pressure on the opponent. So we're going to attack with this rear guard first for 30,000. And typically people take this first attack because they're not really knowing what to look for. So if you think that more pressure should be applied to them, then you can go ahead and attack with the Blaster Rapier first, and just make sure that when you call Dead Armor Dragon is still standing. You don't want to boost with the Dead Armor Dragon per se, unless you know that you want to attack with it, or unless you know that you're going to use the ability right now. You can also call it, of course, behind the Blaster Dark, but it's not needed by any means. So you attack with Blaster Rapier. Since we have the 3 blasters in our front row, she's going to get +5, so she's going to be at 24. They decide to do whatever they want. And then, of course, if they took it, then you can decide to counterblast and retire their rearguard. And then we go ahead and attack with Phantom Blaster Overlord. Now here's an interesting thing that you can go for. You can first go for Dead Armor Dragon skill to Soul Blast and retire. And then you get that guard restrict online. And then you use Phantom Blaster Dragon's own skill, Counterblast and retire. You can say retire the Nemain and the Blaster Rapier, so that you can reset a whole column from your deck. So in this case, it's not a bad idea to go for Blaster Axe and Blaster Dagger. And your opponent would also have to retire 2 rearguards since you retire 2 of your own. And actually, my mistake. You only call 1 blaster from your deck, so you're not going to be able to get Blaster Dagger. So typically the number that you retire is only with the purpose of getting your opponent to retire the same amount, but it's not a bad, this is not a bad setup still. What's going to happen though is that Blaster Axe is going to get an extra 10k when it's called, and then the guard restrict is going to be applied on Phantom Blaster Overlord, so they're going to have to guard, with 3 cards from hand if they guard with a perfect guard, or they're going to have to guard wisely with actual shield value from their hand, because it is a 2 crit attack. After that happens, then you can go ahead and attack with the Blaster Dark, and you can attack with the Blaster Axe, both of which are 30,000 power, so the opponent's going to have to find a way to deal with that. And then by the time you end your turn, you have a 10k intercept in your front row, as well as a 5k intercept, plus all the cards that you have in your hand from earlier in the game. So yeah, overall, I hope that gives you an idea of how this deck kind of plays. If you enjoyed the deck profile, please consider leaving a like and a comment. please consider subscribing as well. It really helps out. And of course, I'll be uploading more deck profiles, videos, match videos, etc. for Vanguard all throughout the coming days. So look forward to them. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.